0201 hours. Caracas, Venezuela, January 3rd, 2026. The humid Caribbean night ends without warning. 150 American aircraft crossed the Venezuelan coastline in a formation that took 5 months to assemble and 4 hours to execute. The subsonic roar reaches the city before anyone on the ground has processed what is producing it. By the time the sound registers, the first strikes are already complete. This is not the beginning of the operation. It is the last 4 hours of one. The beginning was August 2025, and it looked like a carrier strike group conducting routine maritime security operations in the Caribbean. The USS Gerald R. Ford, leading Carrier Strike Group 12 with her R. Lee Burke-class escorts, USS Ramage and USS McFall among them, had been maintaining a sustained blockade posture since late summer, intercepting oil tankers operating under sanctioned flags and interdicting drug trafficking vessels linked to the Cartel of the Suns, the criminal enterprise whose revenue streams ran through the Venezuelan military's command structure and had been documented in a sealed Southern District indictment for years. To a casual observer following ship tracking data, it was a pressure campaign. To anyone who understood what a carrier strike group's maintenance cycle and replenishment schedule was communicating, it was something more specific. The Ford was not cycling through a standard deployment rhythm. She was being kept on station. The tempo of her aircraft operations, the types of sorties, the electronic emissions profile of her airborne platforms during those sorties was the kind of signature that appears when a strike group is not patrolling but mapping every Venezuelan coastal radar frequency, every air defense battery's activation schedule, every shift change pattern in the integrated air defense network that Russia had helped Caracas build over the previous decade. Somewhere in an undisclosed location, Delta Force operators were doing something that had not been announced in any press release. They were running breach drills against a full-scale replica of the Miraflores presidential compound, built to the dimensions that satellite imagery and signals intelligence had established with enough precision to replicate the reinforced safe room at the back of the residence, the steel door sanctuary that Maduro's security doctrine designated as the endpoint of any emergency protective action. They were practicing what happened when the target was 3 feet from that door. The adversary's defensive architecture deserves serious assessment. The S-300VM system protecting Caracas was the same export variant that Russia had spent years positioning as the definitive answer to Western air power. A long-range, multi-channel surface-to-air missile system capable of simultaneously engaging multiple targets at high altitude, designed to create a denial zone that fourth-generation aircraft could not penetrate without catastrophic losses. Buk M2 complexes provided medium-altitude coverage. A fleet of Su-30 Mk-2V flanker aircraft sat at La Carlota Air Base and Fort Tiuna, available to challenge any airborne incursion if they could get airborne in time. The psychological dimension of the defense mattered as much as the hardware. The Maduro government had spent years constructing the narrative that Russian partnership provided a security guarantee, that the alliance with Moscow translated into a practical deterrent against American military action. That narrative had survived every pressure campaign applied since 2017. The fortress mentality it produced inside the Venezuelan high command was the operational asset that the planning team in Washington was counting on. A command culture that believes it is protected by an impenetrable air defense network and a Russian-backed deterrent does not maintain the same level of procedural discipline that a command culture expecting attack at any moment maintains. They do not run their radars continuously because continuous radar operation reveals emission patterns. They do not keep their fighters at cockpit-ready alert because that level of readiness is expensive and difficult to sustain indefinitely. They trust the system. The system was about to be attacked at its data links rather than its launchers. The pre-kinetic phase began days before the first aircraft crossed the coastline. The U.S. Navy's cyber warfare units, operating through channels that left no attribution trail the Venezuelan technical staff could follow in real time, began working through the communication architecture that connected Caracas's Air Defense Command Center to its regional radar sites and battery commanders. A modern integrated air defense system is not a collection of independent weapons. It is a network. The radar sees the target, the data link carries the targeting solution to the battery's fire control radar executes the engagement. Sever the data link and you have disconnected the network's inputs from its outputs. Expensive launchers with no targeting data, radar sites with no way to communicate what they are seeing. The severance was surgical and invisible. Venezuelan commanders did not know their network was being degraded. The screen still showed data. The communication system still showed connectivity. The degradation was in the reliability of what was being transmitted. Noise introduced into the data stream in ways that would only become apparent in the specific conditions of an active multi-axis attack, at the moment when reliable data mattered most. At H-hour minus 90 minutes, the aircraft were already in the air. F-22, Raptors, and F-35C. Lightning IIs were flying ingress routes computed to keep their approach geometry inside the radar horizon gaps that 5 months of emissions intelligence had mapped. The Venezuelan radar network had known blind spots. Not design flaws, but geometric realities created by the topography between the radar sites and the coastline approaches. The ingress routes threaded those gaps. Behind the stealth aircraft, EA/18G Growler electronic attack platforms from the Navy's electronic attack squadrons were establishing broadband jamming coverage across the S-300VM's operational frequency bands. The Growler's AN/ALQ-99 high-band jamming pods were not attempting to destroy the radar. They were saturating the frequency space the system needed to function, turning the tracking picture into noise at the moment when the S-300VM battery operators needed clarity. The heavy suppression work was handled by B-1B Lancers, carrying AGM-154 joint standoff weapons. The JSOW is a glide weapon. No motor, no signature after release, dropped from standoff ranges that kept the launch aircraft outside Venezuelan weapons range. The 130-kilometer standoff margin meant the B-1Bs never entered the defended airspace. The weapons they released glided in and deleted the physical antenna arrays and command vehicles that the data link attack had already degraded. The S-300VM batteries went from degraded to offline in a sequence that Venezuelan commanders could watch on their screens but could not interrupt because their communication channels to the battery sites were returning error codes. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, were flying their MH-47G Chinooks and MH-60M Blackhawks at 100 feet above the wave surface, using the coastal terrain geometry to stay below whatever radar capacity remained functional. These aircraft carry AN/APQ-174 multimode terrain following radar and integrated radio frequency countermeasure suites that let them operate in a partially contested environment without the electromagnetic profile that standard military helicopters produce. They were invisible to the degraded network that remained. They were flying toward a city that, at the moment they crossed the coastline, went dark. The cyber strike on Caracas's power grid executed at H-hour. Not the entire grid, the strike was targeted at the substations serving the military district and the presidential residence area. The city's commercial power went out. Backup generators at military facilities activated. The activation of those generators, a predictable response to grid failure, produced a detectable emission signature that confirmed which facilities were military priority sites for the strike packages still inbound. In the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, the tactical picture showed 150 aircraft across 20 different bases converging on Caracas in a coordinated time-on-target sequence whose planning had required months to deconflict. Every pilot shared the same tactical picture through the Link 16 network. Every ground operator's position data was feeding in real time through biometric and GPS sensors back to the Ford's command node. The Virginia-class submarine USS Montana had already launched her Tomahawk Block 5 missiles on pre-programmed terrain-following profiles aimed at radar sites and command facilities. The missiles were in the air before the aircraft crossed the coast. At 02:01, the first strikes hit the antenna farms at Fort Tiuna and La Carlota simultaneously. The Su-30 aircraft that had been on ground alert at La Carlota did not get airborne. Precision-guided munitions reached their hardened shelters before the scramble sequence could complete. The pilots who would have flown them were running toward aircraft that were no longer operationally intact. 3 MH-47G Chinooks flared into the Miraflores compound in the window of absolute surprise that the simultaneous strike packages had created. Venezuelan presidential security had a protective action protocol. When that protocol activated, when the alarm systems inside the residence registered the sound of explosions across the city, the protocol directed the principal to the reinforced safe room. The safe room was the endpoint of the security doctrine. Delta Force operators rehearsed on a full-scale replica of the route from the residence quarters to that endpoint were moving faster than the protocol. Maduro was feet from the reinforced door when the lead element reached him. There was no extended firefight inside the residence. The operations tempo was faster than the response cycle of the protective detail. Loyalist barracks in the adjacent military district were generating heavy fire toward the compound perimeter. The Night Stalker door gunners engaged that fire with the accuracy that sustained training in close quarters airborne fire support produces. One Chinook took damage, not structural, not disabling, but documented. The extraction element loaded, and by 0220, the birds were climbing away from the compound, turning toward the coast inside a protective corridor of FA-18E Super Hornets and F-35Cs that had established an exclusion zone over the capital. One Loyalist tank platoon attempted to move toward the compound through the chaos. An MQ-9 Reaper that had been holding at 20,000 feet on loitering close air support tasking engaged it with Hellfire missiles before it reached the first intersection. The Venezuelan commanders, screaming into their communications equipment, were screaming into a network that was returning noise. By 0329 Eastern Time, the extraction force was over international waters. The high-value packages were on the deck of the USS Bataan. The announcement came through a Truth Social post at approximately 0420. The reaction in Moscow and Beijing required no analysis. The financial exposure that Russian state entities held in Venezuelan infrastructure, denominated in a currency backed by a government that no longer controlled its own capital, had become a different kind of asset overnight. The damage assessment on the Venezuelan integrated air defense system was not measured in individual launchers destroyed. It was measured in network nodes, the data links severed, the command vehicles eliminated, the radar arrays whose emission signatures would never again appear on a targeting receiver anywhere in the hemisphere. 7 major explosive events documented by satellite imagery. Every one of them a node in the architecture that Russia had positioned as the definitive deterrent against exactly this kind of operation. The operations lesson is not about Delta Force or F-22 stealth or the electronic warfare architecture of the EA-18G. Each of those elements performed as designed and as trained. The lesson is about the planning horizon that produced those elements being in the right place at the right time with the right preparation. 5 months of carrier strike group presence that looked like a blockade was 5 months of emissions intelligence collection that built the precise picture of where every radar gap was, when every radar was active, and which data links connected which nodes in the network. The safe room replica that Delta Force operators were breaching in an undisclosed location in November was built from the same intelligence collection program. The cyber degradation of the data links was running before any aircraft left any runway. By the time 150 aircraft crossed the Venezuelan coastline, the outcome had been computed with enough precision that the only variable the planning team had modeled as uncertain was the specific location of the target inside the compound at each hour. The safe room endpoint was the solution to that uncertainty. The protocol that directed the target toward that endpoint was the protocol that Delta Force rehearsed against. Venezuela's defensive architecture was designed for the threat it expected: a public ultimatum, a gradual escalation, a political debate in Washington that would take months to produce a decision. What arrived instead was the result of a decision made 5 months earlier, executed with a precision that the Venezuelan military's 20th century threat model had not included in its planning assumptions. The USS Gerald R. Ford maintained her station off the coast through the morning. Her aircraft were landing, being rearmed and refueled, and launching again on combat air patrol cycles that held the exclusion zone over Caracas intact. The Southern District of New York unsealed its indictment. The Cartel of the Sun's operational leadership was in custody or in flight. In Miami, Little Havana. In the Kremlin, silence of a specific quality. In Beijing, a recalculation of exposure. The rules governing what is and is not possible against a state that has positioned itself as protected by a Russian air defense umbrella and a narco-state revenue structure were rewritten in 4 hours. The rewrite happened not because the S-300VM was defeated by superior sensors. It was defeated before the kinetic phase began, by a data link degradation operation that turned it from a network into a collection of expensive launchers with no targeting picture. The Miraflores compound is empty this morning. The Ford is still on station. The indictment is unsealed. If this breakdown gave you a clear picture of how modern joint force operations compress 5 months of preparation into a 4-hour execution window, subscribe and share it. More of these analyses keep coming as long as you are here for them.